skeletons. What should we do with them?
So my name is Watson-Hicks. My profession is I'm a Chief Risk and Compliance Officer. I'm also a qualified accountant, and I've worked in various parts of financial services for about 25 years now. And as to how we met, at the ICAP Charity Day in full fancy dress some years ago.
Yeah, so biggest fancy dress party in the world. I must say, I worked there. I loved it. What does it actually mean to be a kind of chief risk and compliance officer? What does that really mean to you?
So I think, as you say, if you have the word chief in front of your title, you are a member of the executive. So to my mind, that's your team. You're a business leader first, and you're a technical expert second. So you lead your team, your department, and you use your technical expertise and your experience there. But your first responsibility is as a business leader, but obviously as a risk person, a risk and compliance person, you come with that perspective of your own experience. You're looking at things through that lens.
Excellent. So I mean, what are some of the barriers that kind of you might face? Because I know, because I've worked in second line functions and first line functions. And I remember kind of when I was in front office and when I was kind of part of that so-called revenue generation operation, which I very much enjoyed, I was one of those people. I said, "Oh, why do we have to do this? What's the issue? Are you sure we got to do this?" And kind of how have you found is a good way to kind of overcome some of those barriers and actually be seen first and foremost as a business leader and a risk and compliance officer second?
I think it has a lot to do with the maturity of the organisation. So if an organisation is brand new to the idea of risk management or has recently come into scope of regulation and isn't experienced with that before, of course they're going to ask the question, are you just an overhead, a cost of doing business? You can't add any value, but we're not allowed to operate without you. Or can this actually deliver us some commercial value? And I think the initial response generally in all businesses, certainly most ones that I've come into contact with, quite rightly, people are asking what value is going to be added by this, by this role, by these people, by this extra cost. And I think people always start from the position of, we've managed without it, so clearly we don't need it. Then they kind of come around to, okay, we are required to have it. Perhaps it's because we're a regulated entity and you can't really operate without it. But we might treat it at that point as a sort of cost overhead, and we'll employ people, but we'll sort of make them sit in the corner. I think it takes quite a long time to build trust with the first line and to be able to demonstrate that you can actually deliver some commercial value. And I wouldn't expect anybody to be able to do that overnight, because it's still a relatively new thing. If you think about the history of financial services, and the financial crisis was 20 years ago almost, but different industries are at different stages of maturity. So I think it takes a long time to build that trust. But fundamentally, risk management done well does deliver some commercial value, because as a business, you have a strategy at the very highest level. You have a strategy, you've got your strategic aims, your strategic goals, and you have risks to delivering that. And your job as an executive is to do the resource allocation to make sure that you manage those risks so you can continue to pursue that strategy. Once you're able to demonstrate that, people are a lot more on board. But the ability to do that requires you to have a seat at that table, which is why mature organisations will have that role on their executive. Less mature ones probably tend to have it reporting into, say, the legal department, general counsel or COO or something like that. And I think things are changing, but so 20 years ago, somebody like me would not have been on an executive team. They probably would have sort of been sat in a corner. But it's changing, but it's organisation specific, I think.
Sat in the corner staring out the window, kind of wondering why you chose this risky lifestyle. Yeah, yeah. Which is going to be an episode that we do later on. It's
right.
yeah. So
yeah.
we're trying to make this as fun as possible, and we're also trying to, and this is going to be the first time that I mention it, is we're going to try not to use the word or the phrase regulatory compliance.
Okay.
But that said, I would like to kind of pose the question is, so actually two questions. Right. The first one is, do you think the role of the risk department or the role of the CRO has become about regulatory compliance? And if you think that, why do you think that is?
Again, I'd come back to the maturity point. I think sometimes that's the entry into an organisation, is there's a regulatory expectation that you have a competent second line defence. So that will sort of get you in the door. Thereafter, it can't just be about making sure we tick boxes to be seen to be compliant. That's not a good use of resources, quite frankly. So yeah, I think it's a journey. I would come back to that point. It's a journey. Different organisations will be at different points on that journey, and different industries will be at different points on that journey.
Yeah. Okay, good. So we haven't actually told you what the title of this episode's going to be. We haven't. We said in the teaser that it's going to be raw and uncut. So one of the reasons I didn't tell you is I kind of want to capture your facial expression when I tell you what we're going to advertise this episode as. We're going to call it "Does My Board Know What They're Doing?"
Right.
But we're going to try and kind of talk about that in a way that kind of isn't patronising, and kind of it's actually, do you know what? People who sit on boards, they have a very difficult position.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
But particularly now, because there's kind of real accountability, real responsibilities, and also because you see there are firms failing, publicly and privately, and actually when you kind of dig in, you sometimes want to ask the question, well, what were the senior management team doing? Was it because they didn't understand, or was it because their risk person didn't give them the right information? So kind of raw and uncut. Right? So that's going to be the title of the episode. So kind of what do you feel about a few of the things that I've just said? I mean, how do you take your board on that journey so that you can get from where they are now to actually we really know what we're doing?
So I can only speak sort of from my experience and with my own frame of reference, and certainly wouldn't name any organisations. So I'll just put all of those things together and kind of come up with a general answer. Is I think board members, as you say, do an incredibly difficult job. They're there to oversee an entire organisation, and they have to do it with 4 quarterly meetings a year. And they are very exposed to the credibility of the senior leadership team. So if boards aren't given the right information, they don't stand a chance, and that's not fair. But they need to be in a position to be able to know whether what they are seeing is good quality or not. So it could absolutely be the case that a business fails, and then you find that the board had been regularly given information from someone like me to say that everything's fine. In which case, clearly you'd have sympathy with board members if they're not getting what they need. I think on the other side of that, what they need to have is the ability to ask the right questions. So they need to know how to challenge someone with deep technical expertise that isn't necessarily their area of expertise. So you're generally not going to have board members who bring experience from having done every single role around an executive table. So there has to be an element of trust between them and the executive that they'll get something which is meaningful. And of course, they're not running the business in a hands-on way and there every day. So they're very reliant on that quarterly meeting and what they're seeing. they have to be able to say, they have to be able to comfortable to challenge an executive and say, I'm not quite sure that what you're showing us is measuring the right thing, or I'm not sure that where you've set your parameters is entirely accurate, or every report you send us is, RAG status is green everywhere. Is that actually reflective? And I think people have to feel comfortable to do that, and the executive has to feel comfortable to accept it as well. And as a second line professional, my job is review, oversight, and challenge. Being the critical friend, I have to be able to, take that as well, but coming in the other direction from board members, and that's quite right. I don't mind that at all. I think that shows, a really good level of insight and really good board skills when people say, well, how do I know that what you're giving me is robust and you're measuring the right things and you're operating within the right parameters? Can you explain a few of these things to me?
That's good. I kind of want to kind of lean into a couple of things there. And so one of the things that you kind of mentioned, so you didn't say it exactly like this, I'm going to call it data, right? And data and turning data into information and then presenting it in dashboards. Everyone wants a dashboard and a one pager, and make it simple. Explain it in language that a 5-year-old would understand. Now, what about if I said to you, well, there aren't any 5-year-olds around this table, right? We work in a technical industry. There's a certain amount of jargon, and actually you need to understand it. Now, very easy for me to sit here and say that in the safety of the studio, and I wouldn't dream of saying it like that, to a client or to a board member. But kind of but lots of people think it, and kind of how do you feel about that? It's actually, if you are sitting around this table with me as a CXO, I kind of expect you to have some level of technical expertise. How do you feel about what I've just said just there?
Well, clearly within your executive, you have to have a very deep level of technical expertise, because you talk about people who've grown up in a particular, side of a business. For board members, it's slightly different, obviously, because, particularly now, I'm pleased to say that boards are a lot more diverse than they used to be, and in many respects, but ultimately you're looking for cognitive diversity, so you don't get the sort of, groupthink. I think you have to be, so you need to bring in board members from outside of your own industry with different experience, with different perspectives, so that you don't all just sort of, sit there thinking in the same way and just nodding everything through. And that's absolutely right, and I completely agree with that. But the downside is that means they're not going to necessarily have direct hands-on technical experience of your business. Clearly, the onus is on them to learn and to ask the right questions, but you need to provide a bit of education yourself as well, I think. And the way that I've always sort of felt comfortable operating is that within a boardroom situation, not everybody is going to feel comfortable, particularly as a new board member, to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand half of the things that's written on this page. Can you explain it to me? But they're much more comfortable to do that on a one-to-one basis and say, oh, I'm not sure what this meant. Can you help me? So I think a quick, when there's a new board member, I think the best thing that they can do is to sit down with all the executive and say, look, talk me through, teach me the language that you speak. What's the terminology that I need to be familiar with, so that I don't feel like I'm wasting time in a boardroom situation? Go, just remind me, what does this stand for? So there are certain things, certain acronyms that everybody sort of should be familiar with. But beyond that, every organisation kind of almost has its own unique language. And if you live and breathe it, that's absolutely fine. But if you come in 4 times a year for a board meeting, you can't expect people to be able to talk in acronyms all the time. It's ridiculous. So you've got to be, I think, we have to be comfortable as executives to educate board members, but they also need to be comfortable to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. I think some of the best board members that I've worked with have had the confidence to sort of stop a board meeting and say, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? Because that's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of the strength of knowing that there's something that you don't know and you need it explained.
Good, yeah. So
should be more of that.
Yeah, there should be, and I think one of the things that you've implied is you've got to spend quite a lot of time outside the boardroom
Yes.
dealing with stuff, which of course is obvious, and it kind of everybody knows that. And we kind of talked about those kind of 4 quarterly meetings a year, and actually, we do need to spend more time, with our board members. And also, the other thing that kind of I think I want to kind of bring out that you said that's really important is that we've kind of got to be not just bilingual, we've got to be trilingual, haven't we? We've got to be we've got to use the business language. We've got to use our own internal jargon, and we've got to speak 5-year-old, right? Because I think there is a place for plain English.
Absolutely.
We absolutely
Yes.
need to kind of have plain English, but I think sometimes there are groups of people that mistake plain English for dumbing it down, and there are some subjects that kind of can't afford to dumb down. So you mentioned the global financial crisis. Now, there are many people that remember that, but probably many people in senior positions that, although they remember it happening, they weren't necessarily, because they were, still starting out in their careers or quite young in their careers, they perhaps didn't fully appreciate what was going on. Whereas kind of, people who were a bit more senior at that time really fully appreciated what was going on. And then there's been lots of discussion afterwards about how it went wrong. And I think, I think one of the places where it went wrong is that, I talk about it, I call it the paperclip discussion, where it's very easy. Everyone's got a view on how many paper clips we're using and how much money we're spending on paper clips, or to bring that analogy, maybe into the into 2025, how many iPads we bought for everybody. And so you spend a lot of time talking about that. Then you spend an equivalent amount of time talking about revenue, and then you say, right, we've got 5 minutes to talk about this really complex thing, and we're bringing this expert in to talk about it. So we found the person who has the most technical expertise in the institution to come and talk about this new product or kind of new concept, and you got 5 minutes, right? And I think I certainly kind of have seen that. I certainly saw it as I was coming up.
There is definitely a role for pre-positioning, 100%. That scenario that you've just described is a bit of a nightmare. 5 minutes before the end of the meeting, very technical subject, bringing in a technical expert, speaking to non-technical people, you're probably not going to get the right outcome from that item. So I think that a lot of work needs to go into your agenda and thinking about, there's only a certain number of hours in the day and hours in the meeting, and so you take more time on one subject, you've got to take it away from something else. There's a balance to be struck. But if you're leaving an important thing until last, a technical important thing until last, that's not ideal. If it's a very technical subject that you've pre-positioned with people and they feel comfortable to make a decision, you probably can get one in 5 minutes. But in the scenario that you just described, in my experience, the highly technical person maybe isn't the most senior person in the organisation, may feel nervous to come and speak to the board. The board feels a little bit exposed because here's a highly technical person and they don't maybe feel equipped to be able to challenge them properly. So if there can be some sort of meeting outside of the board meeting, just to say, just for people to get to know each other a little bit, then that removes that barrier of, each being afraid that they're not getting what they need from the other, and also allows them in a safe space to ask some technical questions if there's something that they're not familiar with. When you need to make a decision about anything in 5 minutes, you have to have discussed it in advance. So whether that's further up at a different time during that board meeting or it's outside of the meeting, I guess that's up to the chair. But I personally wouldn't feel comfortable if I were a board member making a decision on something I didn't fully understand in the dying moments of a board meeting. Not sort of speaking the same language as the person who's come to present it.
Yeah, interesting. And how do you feel? I'm going to talk a little bit about saying where you said, sometimes that technical expert is not the most senior, so sometimes they're junior. Yeah, kind of. So they come in, and let's just say technical expert, junior person. They come in, they're not comfortable, but someone says, "Well, you're the expert, right? Yeah, fine, tick," and they kind of move on. I reckon that is that. I mean, I don't see that quite so much these days. But what I do see in some places, or at least hear about, is where this idea of delegation. So great, you have to. The board has to delegate responsibilities to away, and then and if you're a firm that kind of is in scope of the senior manager certification regime, then you've got a whole complex landscape that you've got to kind of navigate. If you're a firm that doesn't have that, the landscape is, let's just say, less complex, but you still need to have some responsibilities laid out there. But what I want to ask is this idea of like you just delegate things, you delegate and you delegate and you delegate and you delegate. Before you know it, kind of you have delegated something really quite important to a junior person who spends their whole life thinking about it, turning a handle, understands their subject, but nonetheless is turning a handle to create reports, and doesn't really have time to think about what that information is doing. And then the subject gets associated with the seniority, and then it's that sort of that almost that lethal combination where you kind of think, well, it can't be that important because that person we pay minimum wage is doing it, and so how are you going to deal with that?
Well, that's a really tricky one, isn't it? And I think I've been on both sides of that sort of situation, really. So I've been the very junior person sort of coming to present to a board for the first time on a subject that I'm very comfortable with, but in an environment that I'm not. And all of the feelings of kind of, you walk into a board meeting, they're already running a bit late, so everybody sort of looks very cross and impatient, and they ask you to just bring out the key points, and you're thinking, what have I done wrong? And then you're not going to give a good account of yourself, and you're not going to, and your subject. So I think it's really important that no matter how junior people are, that we get them used to quite early on the idea of, where does my job fit in with the whole of the organisation? What is corporate governance, and why is it important? And I think the sooner you can get
I don't know.
There's another podcast for you. I'll give you that idea for free.
Yeah.
The sooner you can get people comfortable to present to boards, the better. And I definitely believe that you need to bring people in early on, even if it's just to observe, so that they understand and they feel comfortable to come into that environment. But I do get that it's, boards don't want to have people just observing them, or, junior people coming in and they're not quite sure how to present. But the other side of that is, well, how will they learn? If if they get to a senior management position and they've never done it before, they might not be very good. So I think it's really important to make sure that you don't, just go from one end of the value chain to the other without any idea of how it all fits together.
So these soft skills are actually quite hard.
Yes, absolutely. And
I've been waiting my whole life to say that.
But I think it's really important. I think, my own sort of personal journey with that was terrifying, and I did a little sort of talk course in a previous organisation to some senior leaders to talk about presenting to boards with impact, because I had the opportunity to see those people being very competent and very good at their jobs and very good at discussing things and having excellent debates with each other, and then coming into a boardroom and just sort of freezing. And I've been that person who just froze, and you sort of look around the room and everybody looks a bit cross, but it's nothing to do with you. It's the rest of the meeting ran behind, or you might have just walked in and they've had an argument about something, but it can really wrong foot you. I just think it's really important to make sure that people don't feel nervous and they feel comfortable in a board setting, and the thing that I always say to people doing it for the first time is, don't be frightened of them, they're just as frightened as you, because you're the technical expert and the board are thinking, oh my goodness, am I going to make a fool of myself in front of a technical expert? And you're sitting there going, I'm just a technical expert. Oh my goodness, am I going to make a fool of myself in front of this really important board? And actually, you've all got the same objective, which is not to make a fool of yourself and to make the right decision for the business. So you're all in it together. And sometimes I think maybe that dynamic isn't there when it could be, with a bit of pre-positioning and a bit of coaching beforehand.
Yeah, good. I mean, you're talking about managing wrong way risk, right? So you've got you've got this kind of lethal combination of a junior person, a technical subject, and someone who is nervous.
Yes.
Presenting to let's say an unsympathetic audience who just want to get out of the room. So they're kind of thinking, yeah, we kind of know this is important, but it's only been given 5 minutes, so how important can it be?
Hence the scheduling.
Exactly, and then we warehouse 10 billion of subprime assets, and it all goes pop.
That happens.
And actually, that was I think a small amount, but the other thing that kind of I wanted to talk to you about, which is again about that subject, about kind of delegating away, and I kind of want to bring delegating away together with setting limits, because of course boards and exec committees, particularly in financial services, they spend a lot of time talking about triggers and limits at the behest of regulators, but also because actually you kind of need to have some boundaries within which you kind of operate and pursue those revenue objectives. And I want to talk to you a little bit about credit, right? We're going to have another episode on kind of so looking at financial resilience. But this is the thing where I've often heard people say, well, we've got credit limits, so it's okay. I said, well, yeah, credit limits don't stop you losing money. You are actually saying, when you set a limit, this is how much money we're prepared to lose with this client in pursuit of the revenue from this client. And so when you delegate that away, you've just delegated all of that down to this really junior person. So that junior person is deciding how much money you want to lose. Although kind of this is definitely not a lecture about risk management, but it's kind of more, well, how do we deal with not just getting sort of let's just say less experienced people in front of the board. So junior doctors, they spent all that time saying, no, we're not junior, we want to get rid of that.
Yes,
Let's stop saying that. Let's just say kind of less experienced people. How do we get less experienced people in front of the board in an environment that both they can flourish and the board, or I'm using board as a kind of a euphemism for a senior forum with C-suite in attendance?
Well, I think training is quite a good way of doing that, because I think whoever the senior audience is, so as you say, a board or some kind of senior leadership team or executive team, you're there to learn. So the assumption is that you don't know very much about the subject, and you can ask as many questions as you like. So it's a kind of a relaxed thing, and the person that has been brought in to teach you all about it wants you to learn, so that they will be able to give their messages to you in a way that you understand. So I think that is a good. I've seen that work really, really well. So I've seen people use stories and games as a way of teaching people rather than sort of giving them a lecture, and it creates a situation whereby this senior audience is very grateful to their less experienced colleague for teaching them something that's important and that they need to understand in a way that they can take the information in.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of stories and games.
Yeah.
We've worked with clients where external firms, like a little plug for Cyber Griffin, great firm that brings kind of cybersecurity ideas to a firm. Oh, and it's all free. It's government sponsored, so it's great.
Right.
But storytelling and games. So I like a bit of storytelling. Anyone who knows me knows that. I use it as a way of kind of connecting with people. I'm trying to kind of make the subjects resonate.
Yeah.
In the spirit of kind of this is about you and kind of your voice. I'm going to put you on the spot because you're talking about practice and a rehearsal. Maybe we should have done a rehearsal, but
hopefully it won't show, Simon. But yeah.
Yeah, but it definitely won't. But the question I'm going to ask you before I go back to, does my board know what they're doing? Is pick a story, right? Pick a story that you think has either helped you, hindered you, a career defining moment, whatever it is. I mean, be careful about data convergence to kind of make sure it doesn't give it away if it's a bit too risky. But I'll leave it to you. Right? It's your voice. You tell me a story.
I remember one particular thing. This was an actuarial subject.
Oh God, can you get a pillow? I need to have a nap.
As soon as I hear that word, I just think terribly complicated, really difficult to understand. And I had somebody deliver a training course. It was to the board and to the executive on this particular subject, and it was about longevity risk. And he, again, not everybody's sort of
LE50.
not everybody's cup of tea,
Yeah.
but he was really, really. He was just an excellent presenter, and he kind of used humour, and he was, it's a difficult subject. It's a bit boring. But he really, really well explained at a macro level how it's done, and in a way that people left thinking, oh, I get that now. I understand. And I think in a way, he did his profession a really good, set a really good example for his profession, because I left that conversation thinking, I can understand actuarial things if somebody explains them to me like that.
Yeah.
And so use of, I mean, this was an in-person thing, use of kind of standing at the front, having a whiteboard, whether virtual or an actual, pen, drawing things, having audience interaction, getting people, involved, all creates an environment where people feel psychologically safe to say things like, I really don't understand. Can you say that again? I really don't understand it, and I need to, because I've got to make some important decisions on it. Can you explain that again? For the person to then say, yeah, absolutely, and then not repeat back what they just said, but slightly slower. Take another way of explaining it. Relate it back to an experience that people can connect with from their own lives. That's also a good way, I think, because people have different learning styles, don't they? But if you've got something that combines a bit of the visual, a bit of the storytelling, a bit of the humour, a bit of involving people, then you probably have some aspect of that works for everybody. That means that everybody takes away the right message.
Yeah, and actually, I'm pleased you told that story. Kind of longevity, kind of the because there are certain financial products that I'll say this sensitively, basically profit from your death. And I suppose actually that must be sometimes a bit of a difficult question to navigate at a board if you're not naturally in that business.
Yes. And
you kind of want to kind of create some sort of, if you like, life settlements business. I don't know the specifics of that story. Not necessarily interested in. Well, it's not that I'm not interested. It's probably not right for public consumption. But kind of, it's about navigating those grey areas. So quite often, you have technical complexity, grey area, and kind of how do you kind of marry those two things together so that you can answer the question with a yes. Does my board know what they're doing?
Well, I think there's sort of an ethical angle then, if I'm understanding correctly what you're saying. Do people understand it sufficiently that they feel that ethically that they're okay with the idea of that product, and so in the crudest terms, as you say, profiting from somebody's death doesn't sound like a very morally acceptable thing to do, but in the right context, and understanding how other stakeholders benefit from that, and understanding how the end client, has contracted with you and they understand fully what they're doing and they've entered into that agreement, having been given all the right information, then I think, you've kind of covered all the bases with the conversation. But in terms of, does the board know what they're doing, I think the acid test is, could they go and explain that to somebody on another board in a completely different organisation and feel confident talking about it and answering questions about it?
So maybe we should advocate an exchange program where kind of board members from, let's say in sector, a few board members get together and they kind of go and visit other people's boards for some sort of kind of in camera session, and actually when we did this happened. Have you done that? And because I think you talked about training, and I think training doesn't stop when you reach a certain level. And again, I'm not talking about CPD and regulatory compliance. I'm talking about things that kind of can actually help you manage the business. And it's not that I'm saying that other training can't, but we seem to spend a lot of time on AML training and perhaps not enough time on actually how does this business actually work, and what are we sensitive to. And I think that kind of bring it back to kind of managing risk, is that kind of understanding what your business is sensitive to, and then deciding how much of that you want to do.
That's exactly
is actually where I think C-suite need to operate.
Yes.
And balancing that always with revenue generation. In fact, it's not a balancing act. So it's revenue generation first in the right way.
Yes. Well, I do like the idea of the secondment kind of thing.
It probably exists already. I mean, someone else must have thought of this.
Well, but when you look at portfolio non-executive directors, they bring experience from different but probably related boards. And I think that's very valuable when there's no substitute for having done something already and taken learnings from it. So if you're faced with a particular decision in one board that you've already made on another board and it didn't go very well, or you've got some learnings from that, that's absolutely invaluable experience for another board that's at the beginning of the same journey. So I think portfolio NEDs very often do that because in the back of their mind they're always thinking, when I did this at such and such a business, it worked very well, or it didn't, or here are some things to be aware of. I also think it's really important for board members to network with each other, to do exactly that. And you can do that yourself through your own sort of Rolodex of contacts.
Rolodex.
Yeah. I still remember when people used to have those things. But there are organisations that you can join. That sort of the idea is to link people up, because at board level you're making massive decisions. If you're doing that with a high degree of uncertainty and not enough information to know whether it's going to work, that will leave you in a very vulnerable place. So I think that learning never ends, because why would it?
Does my board know what they're doing? Right. So in order to answer yes to that question, what are the 3 to 5 things that you would expect to be going on at a board meeting?
So I would expect lots of discussion around the subject and lots of challenge. So I would expect boards to, not just to listen and nod, but to, actually ask questions of the person who's presenting to them. I think they would benefit during the meeting from having had the pre-positioning discussions outside of the meeting, and also the kind of chance to meet some of the presenters if that's possible, so that those people feel more comfortable. And I think there does need to be, a lot of it comes down to good chairing. So people will have different levels of comfort with speaking up, and some people will require some encouragement to share their views, other people won't. So I think a good chair makes sure that everybody's opinion is heard, and they kind of, you know, try and rein in some of the more dominant people who might otherwise, you know, be saying too much. I think the agenda needs to be very well thought through, because a glance at the agenda, or, you know, you'll make a judgment within a few seconds as to what's important and what's not. And generally, people will do that on the basis of how much time has been allocated. So the 5 minutes at the end of the meeting, people will just assume, well, it's only 5 minutes at the end. So, yeah, it's probably not very important, as we were discussing earlier. So, yeah, I think it comes down to that. I think there's a lot of preparation that goes into making a board meeting work very well. And I think people, the chair and everybody around the table needs to create an environment where everybody feels psychologically safe. I keep talking about psychological safety.
Maybe we should do an episode on psychological safety, actually.
Yeah, where everybody feels as if they can ask their questions, because, you know, thinking into the future, and somebody, a very wise person once told me that they always think about what will happen come the inquiry. So if something ever went wrong with a decision that you made today, come the inquiry, would you be happy to say that you did everything that you could to understand the subject, and that you could you know, defend the decision that you made based on the information that you had? And if your answer to that would be, well, I didn't really understand it, but I thought everybody else did, so I thought that'd be okay, is not ideal.
Or the wrong answer.
It's just, yeah,
it's just the wrong answer.
Softer way of saying it, but yeah,
this is raw and uncut.
The wrong answer.
Please just say the wrong answer.
It is the wrong answer, but it's also, I think, personally, I think a lot of that probably does go on. You know, when somebody, if you're not following a conversation, I've got better at this as I've got older, and you know, more confident, a little bit less bothered about what people think, because, you know, there will be questions that when you get to a business leadership position, you need to understand parts of the business that you haven't seen before.
And you've got to feel comfortable, I think, to say, I don't know, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you don't know, you have to be comfortable to say that. And you have to be comfortable to say, I don't think I understand this well enough to be able to make a decision. And if that moment comes at the point when you're reading the papers, then it's on you to contact the author and say, look, I know this is important, there's bits I don't understand, and don't feel afraid of looking silly, because you may have asked the question that everybody else was thinking. And if you end up in a situation where everybody thinks everybody else knows the subject, and so they all just say yes, it's not going to work.
AI is going to make risk management redundant.
Myth.
Spreadsheets are still the most used risk management tool in financial services.
Could be true. Absolutely.
More data always means better decisions.
Myth.
Risk people are the therapists of the executive team.
True.
The hardest part of the job isn't identifying risk, it's convincing people they exist.
True.
It's been very informative. Thank you so much, Ellen, for coming on. I happen to know that you're going to be coming back soon, so we're kind of looking forward to that. And kind of there are a few other questions that I didn't get the chance to ask, but I'm going to ask them in front of a total stranger next time.
Great. Can't wait.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.